The largest aircraft carrier in the world puts to sea with doorways and no doors in them. The 28th of November, 1944, 13:30 hours. The naval port of Yokosuka on the western shore of Tokyo Bay. Below, on the living deck and the lower deck, a portion of the watertight doors is physically absent. The frames are there, the coamings are there, and so are the dogging levers, and the openings themselves are finished to specification. The steel leaf that closes the opening has not been fitted, because there was no time to fit it. Through those openings runs the interior of 70,755 tons of warship, and pursuing her that same night is a submarine of roughly 1,500 tons. Aboard the carrier are 2,176 officers and men, about 300 shipyard workers, and 40 civilian employees. She is commanded by Captain Toshio Abe, 46th class of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, former commanding officer of the cruiser Oyodo, commander of a destroyer division at Midway. His confidence is documented by the post-war inquiry into what followed, and it rests on one thing, which is the hull. An armored belt up to 400 millimeters. A flight deck of 75 millimeters of steel, designed to take a direct hit from a bomb of 1,000 pounds. The torpedo defense system of a Yamato-class battleship, inherited along with the hull it was built into. Abe believed that the real threat came from the air, and so he took his ship out into darkness to be far from enemy airfields by first light. His ship's surgeon, Lieutenant Commander Takamasa Yasuma, would later describe his captain as a man who carried the flavor of an ancient samurai. The reasoning was sound. It was wrong in exactly one place, and that place was not in the air. 60 miles to the south, on the surface, in the dark, someone was already watching Captain Abe through an instrument he could not see, and working out his course. To understand where the empty doorways came from, we go back 4.5 years, to a concrete pit on the shore of Tokyo Bay. On the 4th of May, 1940, the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal accepted Dry Dock No. 6 into service. 365 meters long, 67.5 wide, 17 deep. Dimensions on that scale made sense for exactly one class of ship, and on the very same day, without allowing so much as 24 hours to pass, the keel of hull number 110 was laid on the floor of that dock. The third battleship of the Yamato class. Under the original schedule, she would go into the water in October of 1943, receive her 18-inch guns in April of 1944, and commission in March of 1945. Everything that happened inside the dock was hidden behind a fence and a roof. The Kempeitai patrolled the perimeter, the workers lived on the yard, and worked 7 days a week, and speaking about the ship beyond the fence carried a prison sentence. The secrecy held so completely that Shinano remains the only major warship of the 20th century for which no official construction photograph survives. 2 images of her are known to exist, and both were taken by outsiders, one from an American reconnaissance aircraft and one from shore during her trials. In August of 1941, the work slowed because the slip crews were needed to repair the fleet that already existed. By November, with war a question of weeks, every large hull in Japan was reviewed, and most were canceled outright. Hull 110 was stopped along with the rest. Here begins the part of the story that usually gets skipped. The hull could not be taken apart. She was complete almost to the level of the lower deck, and dismantling that much structure would have consumed as much time and steel as building something new. Dry Dock No. 6 was wanted for other work, and so the decision was made to finish the hull to the point where she could be floated and towed out of the way. She had stopped being a project and become a problem of clearing floor space. On the 18th of April, 1942, the Doolittle bombers passed over Yokosuka. In the neighboring dock, they damaged the carrier Ryuho, then under conversion. Hull number 110 went entirely unnoticed by the American crews. Everything changed in the first week of June 1942, off Midway Atoll, where the Imperial Navy lost Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu in a single morning. On the 30th of June, the Navy Minister approved a wartime carrier construction program, and Hull 110 entered it automatically because she was the largest piece of finished steel in the country. Vice Admiral Seiichi Iwamura proposed turning her into a floating aviation fortress, a ship that would steam ahead of the carrier force with no air group of her own, receiving, arming, repairing, and fueling other people's aircraft. The staff officer Shigenori Kami objected and pressed instead for a full strike carrier along the lines of Taiho. What won was the compromise in between. On the 16th of July 1942, the specification was fixed. An armored carrier closely modeled on Taiho, built around magazine floors for the No. 1 and No. 3 turrets already poured into the hull, with bulkheads risen to the middle deck. That compromise decided everything that came afterward. She kept a battleship's armor scheme and received a carrier superstructure, and her internal arrangement stayed a hybrid of two logics that do not fit together. Instead of one main longitudinal passage running the length of the ship, she had two. In a battleship with a trained crew, that gives you redundancy and a margin of survival. Stay with that for a moment, because everything later rests on it. Redundancy works only when the people inside know the way. Almost nobody aboard Shinano knew the way, and she went to sea without ever having held a single abandoned ship drill. In August of 1943, construction slowed again, under the weight of losses in the Solomons and the queue of damaged ships waiting for yard space. Completion was still planned for January of 1945. Then came the Marianas. On the 19th and 20th of June, 1944, in the Philippine Sea, the Imperial Navy lost 3 carriers, Hio, Shokaku, and the brand new Taiho, which was the very ship Hull 110 was being rebuilt to resemble. Taiho was destroyed by a single torpedo because aviation fuel vapor spread through her ventilation system and detonated some 6.5 hours after the hit. The lesson was written in the clearest possible terms, and one of the few design changes worked into Shinano afterward was concrete cofferdams around her aviation gasoline tanks. On the 1st of July 1944, Hull 110 received the name Shinano and the number 212 on the carrier list. Along with the name, she received a new completion date, the 15th of October 1944. 3 months were crossed out, with one decision, and they were not crossed out in the abstract. Those 3 months contained the fitting of watertight doors on the lower decks. They contained the air pressure testing of compartments, which is the single procedure that tells you whether a bulkhead holds water or does not. They contained the sealing of the cable runs that pass through those bulkheads, and the training of the crew on portable pumping equipment. And when that time was removed, what remained aboard was pumping equipment that almost nobody could start. The order itself was phrased honestly. Complete only what is required for the decisive battle. If the ship survives it, the rest will be finished afterward. On the 15th of August 1944, Captain Abe was posted as Chief Equipping Officer, and on the 1st of October, he formally became her commanding officer. The officers who came aboard with him are worth holding on to by name, because each of them looked at the same problem from a different direction. Captain Tadashi Mikami, Executive Officer, formerly Communications Officer, of the battleship Yamashiro. What troubled him were those 2 longitudinal passages, and the fact that the crew had never walked them once in darkness. Commander Haruo Mikami, Damage Control Officer, formerly Chief Engineer of the cruiser Kuma. His responsibility was the watertight doors that did not exist, and the task of keeping water inside whichever compartment it entered. He voiced his doubts to the officers around him openly, and Abe himself. On the 27th of November, 1 day before sailing, he submitted a formal request upward, asking to postpone the passage by a few days in order to finish the work and put the crew through at least one drill. He listed what was missing: doors not fitted, compartments not tested, cable penetrations not sealed in the bulkheads, pumps absent from the drainage and fire main systems. The request was refused the same day. There were 2 reasons, and both of them were real. Yokosuka was expecting a raid, and on the 1st of November the ship had already been photographed by an American reconnaissance aircraft flying a B-29. And on Luzon they were waiting for cargo. There had been one more warning, though nobody at the time treated it as anything except an accident. On the 5th of October, as the dock was being flooded for her float-out, the outer caisson gave way early. Water poured into the pit, drove the ship forward into the head wall, and rocked her back and forth until the levels equalized. Some of the workers were thrown into the water, and none of them were killed. The hydrophone compartment in the bow was damaged, and so was one propeller blade. On the 8th of October, she was towed out briefly for her naming ceremony, attended by Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai in the Emperor's name, and then taken back into the dock. The repairs to her bow were carried out using material left over from her cancelled sister, hull number 111. On the 19th of November, Shinano was commissioned. 9 days remained before she sailed, and in those 9 days, somebody had to decide which mattered more, finishing the ship or hiding her. On the 24th of November, the Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, signed dispatch order number 550. Shinano was to proceed to Kure for completion of her fitting out, escorted by Destroyer Division 17. 2 days later, Imperial General Headquarters added a clause to that order, which had formed no part of the original passage plan. The ship was to carry cargo. On the 26th of November, the order came down to embark 50 Oka Type 11 aircraft, together with personnel of the unit their commander, Captain Motoharu Okamura, had nicknamed Jinrai Butai, the Divine Thunder Corps. The aircraft were bound for Luzon, and they were to get there as fast as possible. The Oka is worth describing precisely because this object returns at the end of the story. A glider of plywood and aluminium, roughly 6 meters long, with 3 solid fuel rockets in the tail and a warhead of 1,200 kilograms in the nose. It had no engine capable of taking off. It was slung under a bomber, released in the vicinity of the target, and steered by hand from a cramped cockpit. The design included no landing gear and no provision of any kind for coming back. The first successful test of the rocket-powered version was carried out at Kashima on the 19th of November, 9 days before Shinano sailed, and series production was authorized immediately afterward. 2 weeks before that, Lieutenant Tsutomu Kariya had been killed in an unpowered drop test of the trainer version. On the day Shinano was lost, Petty Officer Nobuo Kita would be killed in the same kind of test. On the 27th of November, the yard gangs worked in 3 shifts and finished crating and loading the aircraft. 6 Shinyo explosive motorboats went into the hangar alongside them. On that same day, Abe received the refusal of his request for a delay. The logic of that refusal ran as follows. The ship had to be moved out of Yokosuka urgently because a reconnaissance aircraft had already photographed her and a raid could come any day. The cargo had to reach Luzon urgently because the situation in the Philippines was deteriorating by the hour. Each consideration was correct on its own, and taken together, they meant that an unfinished ship would carry the weapons of last resort through waters worked by American submarines. At 13:05 on the 28th of November, the Yokosuka Command notified anti-submarine forces of the departure. At 13:30, Shinano cast off. Her escort was 3 destroyers. Hamakaze, flying the pennant of the acting division commander, Commander Kazue Maekawa, together with Yukikaze and Isokaze. All 3 had come directly from Leyte Gulf, all 3 carried damage, and a request had been submitted for 3 days of repair and rest for their crews. That request was refused for the same reason Abe's was. On the navigating bridge hung a portrait of Emperor Hirohito in a frame. This was standard practice, and in the list of what was to be saved should the ship be lost, the portrait ranked above the men. Now to the machinery, because that is where all of it is decided. By design, Shinano carried 12 boilers. By the time she sailed, 8 had been completed. She went to sea with 6 of them lit, which was reckoned sufficient since it gave her 24 knots. The reasoning was simple and on paper correct. An American submarine makes about 20 knots on the surface and considerably less submerged, and outrunning one at 24 knots presents no difficulty at all. At 18:30, the formation cleared the approaches to Tokyo Bay and came around onto a course along the coast. Darkness fell. 60 miles to the south, running on the surface, was a Balao-class submarine with the hull number 311. Shinano had been under construction for 4 years, 6 months, and 15 days, in a dock built specifically to hold her, by thousands of workers who lived inside the yard under guard. The keel of Archerfish was laid on the 22nd of January 1943 at Portsmouth in the state of Maine, and she was commissioned in September of that same year. 7.5 months from the first plate to the raising of the flag. And across American yards in those same months, dozens of identical hulls were rising alongside her, differing from one another only in details of equipment. More than 100 boats of her class entered service before the war ended. The difference looked like this. At Yokosuka, one ship stood in dry dock number 6, and when she was floated out, the dock stood empty. At Portsmouth, at Groton, at Mare Island, and at Manitowoc, hulls lay on the ways simultaneously, assembled in series, and the departure of any one of them left no hole behind it. The boat was commanded by Commander Joseph Francis Enright, 34 years old, born in Minot, North Dakota, United States Naval Academy, class of 1933. A year earlier, commanding the submarine Dace, he had received an intelligence report on the sailing of the carrier Shokaku, moved into position, conducted a careful approach exactly according to doctrine, and lost the target without firing a single torpedo. On returning, he submitted a request to be relieved of his command, on the grounds that he was responsible for an unproductive patrol. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding submarines in the Pacific, granted it. After that came the beach, and roughly 9 months of staff work at Midway, and in September of 1944, a second boat. The 5th War Patrol of Archerfish began on the 30th of October with departure from Pearl Harbor. Her assignment was a supporting one, lifeguard duty for the first B-29 strikes on the Tokyo area on the 24th and 27th of November. There was nobody to pick up, and after the 27th, the boat was released from that duty. The man who had been relieved of a command for excessive caution turned out to be the one officer in that stretch of ocean who owed nothing to anybody that night and could hunt entirely as he pleased. At 20:48, the radar aboard Archerfish returned to contact at 24,700 yards. At 22:45, the lookouts on Shinano sighted a submarine ahead on the starboard bow. Abe saw what Enright saw, almost at the same moment. What differed was the conclusion each of them drew. Hamikaze, in the lead, had already begun to turn onto an attack run. A signal came from Shinano. "Do not open fire, break off the attack, return to station." The reasoning was stated plainly. The formation might not yet have been detected. The submarine was not particularly close, and detaching a destroyer from the screen meant opening a sector. Abe then laid out for his navigator, Captain Nakamura, his own reconstruction of what was happening. Not long before, a report had come in concerning a group of American submarines that had left Saipan and Guam. Abe joined the two things together and concluded that a screen of roughly 7 submarines was trailing the formation, one of which was deliberately radiating on radar in order to be noticed. The task of that boat, in his reconstruction, was to draw the escorting destroyers away, after which the others would attack the carrier once she had been left uncovered. That reasoning deserves an honest assessment. It was professional, it rested on an actual intelligence report, and in 1944, American submarines genuinely did operate in groups. Abe was not a stupid man, and he was not a frightened one. He had commanded a destroyer division at Midway. He understood anti-submarine work from the inside better than most officers in his Navy, and it was precisely that understanding which led him to a conclusion that was wrong from end to end. There was one submarine. No screen existed at all. Abe's conclusion had a direct consequence. The destroyers stayed with the carrier and made no serious search, and the ship was left to win her distance through speed. At 24 knots, that would have worked inside an hour. At 23:30, the turbine on the starboard inboard shaft overheated. Revolutions were reduced to 192 per minute to let the machinery cool. Speed fell to 18 knots. The propulsion plant that nobody had been given time to run in took away from the ship exactly the advantage for which Abe had declined to hunt. 24 knots against a submarine's 20 knots on the surface means separation. 18 knots against 20 means that the pursuer, hour after hour, works his way ahead along the track. In practical terms, it looked like this. All night, the bridge of Shinano watched the same contact, and all night it drifted not astern, but sideways, toward the forward bearings. At 23:40, the formation came around to due west, and from that moment the submarine stopped chasing and began taking position. At 00:30, the watch again observed something resembling a submarine. Hamikaze was closest and elected to pass the investigation to Yukikaze. Yukikaze never received the signal. Nobody went. At 02:45, Shinano detected a target bearing 30 degrees to starboard at a range of 7,000 meters and ordered Isokaze to investigate. Isokaze went and forced the submarine to dive, which in that moment looked like the screen doing its job. At 0309, at a position bearing 198 degrees, 108 miles from the Omiyazaki lighthouse, 4 torpedoes out of 6 fired, struck Shinano on the starboard side. What follows is usually described as a ship destroyed by a torpedo salvo. The documents show something else. Number 3 boiler room flooded instantly, and every man of the watch inside it was killed at once. Number 7 aft flooded quickly, and there were no men in it. Number 1, inboard of number 3, began taking water steadily through a compromised side bulkhead. The forward torpedo struck at roughly frame 104, and flooding control station number 2, situated below and forward of the bridge on the lower deck, began to fill. The duty officer of that station and part of his men stayed where they were. The list to starboard came to 9 or 10 degrees. The ship held 18 knots. 4 boilers and 3 engines remained online. At 0334, Abe transmitted his first report. The wording survives. Received a torpedo attack of 4 torpedoes in position 32 degrees 55.5 minutes north, 137 degrees 37 minutes east. The word hits does not appear. There is no damage assessment and no request for assistance. Abe elected to keep going at 18 knots. His reason was the same one he had held 4 hours earlier. He was certain the rest of the screen was waiting ahead, and he judged the priority to be clearing the area before a second attack developed. He was also certain that a hull designed as a Yamato-class battleship would absorb 4 hits. The hull absorbed them. The problem was somewhere else. By 0430, the list had reached 15 degrees. The damage control party under Commander Haruo Mikami did the one thing available to them, which was counterflooding. 3,000 tons of seawater were taken into the empty voids on the port side. The list came back to roughly 10 degrees. The ship steadied, and for a short time it appeared that the situation was in hand. That was the last moment at which it was in hand. Water kept working its way deeper into the hull, and it traveled through the things that were absent, through doorways with no doors, through cable penetrations left unsealed, through ventilation trunking never finished and never tested with compressed air, because the 3 months set aside for testing had been struck out by the order of the 1st of July. At 0500, the starboard outboard turbine stopped. 2 shafts remained. At 0520, Abe transmitted his second report, and the change in tone between the first and the second is audible in the text itself. Received 4 torpedo hits, starboard side, abaft the island. Heading for Khitan Strait. Listing 13 degrees to starboard, list increasing, although everything is being done to prevent it. 4 boilers and 2 port engines operational. By 0530, the ship had covered 36 miles from the point of attack and was still making 11 knots. The list kept growing, and at that point came the thing that made everything afterward irreversible. The port side sea suction valves came out of the water. The The trim tanks used to correct list stopped functioning because there was nothing left for them to draw. One method remained: dewatering by hand, with portable equipment. Abe gave that order from the bridge of a ship heeled far enough that standing on it required a braced stance. The order was correct. It was the only order available, and in terms of equipment, it was entirely achievable. Aboard Shinano were portable gasoline-driven salvage pumps, small units that two men carry by the handles, set down beside a bulkhead, start with a pull cord in the manner of an outboard motor, and feed a hose into a flooded space. They were stowed where they were supposed to be stowed. There were enough of them, and almost nobody aboard knew how to start one. Training on portable pumping equipment had been inside those crossed-out weeks. The crew had assembled mostly in October. Part of it had come aboard 9 days before sailing, and in the compartments alongside them were 300 yard workers and 40 civilian employees whom nobody had prepared for anything at all. In passageways sloping at 13 degrees, men stood beside perfectly serviceable machinery, pulled the cord, heard it die, and pulled again, while the water climbed the bulkhead at precisely the rate it would have climbed if that machinery had never been placed aboard. The report of this reached the bridge. Exactly 48 hours earlier, the commanding officer of that ship had written a request in his own hand listing, among his reasons for delay, the absence of pumps in the drainage system, and the impossibility of putting his crew through even one drill. He had been refused. He now stood on a heeling bridge and listened to his own rejected request read back to him, point for point, in the past tense. Now the other side of the same object. In 1942, Lieutenant Harold Burke of the Naval Reserve, before the war a deputy chief of the New York City Fire Department, persuaded the chief of the Bureau of Ships, Rear Admiral Edward Cochrane, to adopt for fleet issue a nozzle producing a fine water fog in place of a solid stream. Together with Lieutenant Thomas Kilduff, formerly of the Boston Fire Department, Burke trained more than 260 instructors, and those instructors stood up damage control schools at every continental naval base in the United States. The men passing through them were not damage control specialists. They were everybody, cooks and yeomen included. The result of that decision was physical. Aboard an American ship in 1944, any sailor pulled out of his bunk in the middle of the night knew where the portable pump was stowed, which end the handles were on, and how many times to pull the cord. Starting a small gasoline motor was as ordinary a skill in the United States Navy as dogging a hatch. There is the gap between two systems, held in a single object. Japan built the largest hull on the planet, and could not supply it with the cheapest thing aboard any warship, which is a man who knows how to start a pump. This was not a shortage of steel. This was a shortage of trained hands. If you have followed this far and you want work at this depth to keep appearing, a like and a subscription genuinely affect whether it does, and what comes next is the part that most retellings of this story leave out entirely. Because at 0600, when the list reached 18 degrees, something stopped that nobody had given a single thought to. At 0600, the list to starboard reached 18 degrees, and at that angle the freshwater evaporator ceased to function. That sentence needs unpacking, because it, rather than the 4 torpedoes, is what killed the ship. A warship's boilers are not fed with seawater. Salt water leaves deposits inside the tubes. The tubes overheat and fail, and so the feed circuit runs on distilled water, which the ship produces continuously for herself in an evaporator. An evaporator is a heat exchanger holding a specific level of liquid. When the hull heels far enough that the level moves out of the working zone, the machine simply stops. At 0600, the reserve of feed water aboard Shinano amounted to roughly 1 hour of boiler operation. There were several thousand people aboard, and among them, nobody could be found who confidently knew how to run the boilers on salt water, and for how many hours they would last. The procedure existed. It was an emergency measure, dirty and damaging to the machinery, and it was used aboard ships whose engineers had been through the relevant instruction. Aboard a ship commissioned 9 days earlier, there were no such engineers. The chief engineer reported that the risk of losing the boilers outright outweighed the gain, and Abe ordered the remaining fires drawn. Look carefully at what has just happened, because it is the same scene played a second time with different equipment. Twice in one morning, a warship of 70,000 tons ran up against the absence not of machinery, but of a person who could operate it. First the pump, then the boiler. At 0720, Shinano lost all way. At 0730, she signaled that she was unnavigable and requested a tow. At 0745, Abe called Hamikaze and Isokaze in to pass a line from the bow. At 0800, Abe gave the order that commanding officers give last. All personnel of the boiler and machinery departments were to leave their stations and come up. Before they went, one task remained. On his order, they flooded the 3 outboard port boiler rooms, numbers 4, 8, and 12, so that the weight of water to port would ease the list to starboard. Men let the sea into the compartments they had been working in, with their own hands, and then climbed to the deck. The effect on the list was small. At 0830, flooding control station number 2 on the lower deck went completely under. That station had begun taking water at the moment the forward torpedo struck, around 3 in the morning. It sat below the waterline, forward of the bridge, and from it was directed the counter-flooding that was still the only thing holding the ship off her beam ends. The division officer in charge, Captain Fumio Inada, and 9 ratings stayed at their posts as the water came across the deck, and they stayed as long as they could still reach the valves. All 10 of them died there. While they worked, the list grew slowly. After 0830, it grew quickly. At 0850, Hamikaze and Isokaze passed their tow lines and began to pull toward Cape Ushio, hoping to put the ship on a shoal. Yukikaze circled on anti-submarine watch. They worked up to 3 knots, and 3 knots was the ceiling, because behind them was a mass of 70,000 tons half filled with water. The cables parted. They were passed again and parted again. The attempt was given up. At 0932, they began transferring the Emperor's portrait off Shinano. It was wrapped and lowered with an escorting officer into a cutter sent across from Hamikaze. The boat pulled away, caught on the starboard torpedo bulge, which the list had by then lifted clear of the water, lost stability, and capsized. The escort and the portrait went into the sea. After that, the process the official accounts describe cautiously began on Shinano's decks. Men moved about the ship who did not know where to go. 300 yard workers and 40 civilian employees had never stood a general quarters muster, were on no station bill, and had nobody set over them. A crew assembled 6 weeks before sailing had never held an abandoned ship drill, and did not know the 2 longitudinal passages that Captain Tadashi Mikami had warned about. Lifeboats and life rings were not aboard in adequate numbers. And here, it was no longer the rush of construction at work, but a standing attitude, which the surviving engineer Hosokawa stated plainly after the war. Leaving the ship was regarded as a failure of nerve, and providing for it in advance was not customary. Around this time, a small fire started aft in the hangar, near the number 2 aircraft lift. That lift was in the down position, and below it, secured in the hangar, were 50 aircraft with warheads of 1,200 kilograms apiece. At 10:18, Abe gave the order to abandon ship. At 10:25, the list to starboard reached 35 degrees, and the colors were struck. Yukikaze came alongside to take men off. At 10:57, Shinano rolled onto her starboard side and turned bottom up. The overturned hull seesawed on the water for some minutes. Then the bow rose and she went down by the stern. 1,435 men went with her. With the ship died her commanding officer, Captain Toshio Abe, who stayed on the bridge by his own choice. With the ship died her chief gunnery officer, Captain Katsumi Yokote, who had come across from the cruiser Tone. With the ship died her navigator, Captain Nakamura, the man to whom Abe had explained the 7 submarines a few hours earlier. With the ship died Captain Fumio Inada and the 9 ratings who never left station number 2. and the whole watch of number 3 boiler room, who were killed in the first seconds. Aboard her that night were about 300 yard workers and 40 civilian employees. 32 of them came out of the water. The men who had built her over 4.5 years, under police guard, living inside the arsenal, forbidden to speak of the work even at home, were lost almost to the last man. All 3 senior officers were posthumously promoted to Rear Admiral. 1,080 people were saved in total. 55 officers, 993 petty officers and ratings, and 32 civilians. Among the survivors were the executive officer, Captain Tadashi Mikami, the surgeon, Lieutenant Commander Takamasa Yasuma, the communications officer, Commander Isao Araki, and 3 pilots of the Divine Thunder Corps. Hamikaze, alerted by the rescued escort, found the Emperor's portrait floating on the sea and recovered it. And now the detail for which the 50 oka were described in such precision at the start. When the hull rolled over, those of them not permanently secured floated up out of the open hangar. Plywood and aluminium float well. Some of the men in the water, who had no boats and no rings, stayed up until the destroyers reached them by holding onto the hulls of manned bombs that had been bound for Luzon to kill American ships. At 1400, rescue operations were completed. At 1600, Commander Kazue Maekawa reported that the crew had been taken aboard, that secret documents were secure, that the imperial portrait was aboard Hamikaze, and requested that quarters and transport be arranged for the survivors at Kure. At 1700 on the 30th of November, the 3 destroyers arrived at Kure. The survivors of Shinano were released neither to their families nor to ordinary hospitals. They were taken to the island of Mitsukojima in Kure Bay and held there in quarantine until January of 1945. There was no medical reason for a quarantine. The reason was informational. Almost nobody inside Japan knew that the ship had existed, and nobody at all was to learn that she was gone. On the 28th of December, an inquiry opened in Tokyo, which appears in the records under the letter S. It was chaired by Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa. Its findings deserve to be given close to the original, because they are more honest than anything one might expect from a service ministry in December of 1944. The commission determined that so many parties shared responsibility that singling out any one of them served no purpose. A gamble had been taken. The gamble was that the ship could be moved to Kure and finished there, and that nothing would happen during one short passage. Because of construction defects and the unfinished state of the vessel, the gamble had been lost. The commission noted design lessons to be carried forward. Nobody was punished. Not the man who refused Abe's request of the 27th of November. Not the authors of the order of the 1st of July that removed 3 months. Not those who, on the 26th of November, added 50 aircraft to a passage that had not been planned to carry any. On the 31st of August, 1945, Shinano was struck from the Navy list. By then, the war had been over for 2 weeks. Now back below the surface, where something close to absurd was taking place. Having fired 6 torpedoes, Enright took Archerfish down to 400 feet and rigged for depth charging. Very few depth charges came. Through the sound gear, the boat listened to the long noise of a hull breaking up, and from that noise the crew understood that the target was going down. What the crew did not understand was what they had taken away from Japan. Enright reported an aircraft carrier of unidentified type, roughly 28,000 tons, estimated by silhouette through the periscope. Staff received that report with skepticism. No Japanese carrier of that size was listed as operating in the area. No confirmation came out of the Tokyo Bay region that week, and there were no intercepts announcing the loss of a major unit, because the Japanese side transmitted no such announcement at all. A decrypt of the 16th of August, 1944, mentioning personnel assignments to a new ship named Shinano, had been read by American intelligence that summer, and the conclusion drawn from it was that since the name belonged to a river, the ship was probably a new cruiser. The full picture assembled only after the surrender, when Japanese documents became available. It emerged then that Archerfish had sunk the largest warship ever destroyed by a submarine, a record that still stands. Enright received the Navy Cross, and the boat received a Presidential Unit Citation. In August of 1945, Enright came ashore at Yokosuka with American forces and walked down into dry dock number 6. He stood on the floor of a concrete pit 365 meters long. Around him were the fence, the roof, and the traces of 4.5 years of work by thousands of people who had been forbidden to speak of what they were doing. Inside it, there was nothing. Assemble the miscalculation whole, because in pieces it reads as a chain of accidents, and whole it reads as something else. Japan built a ship designed to survive any hit, and built her correctly. The armored belt held, the flight deck held, and the torpedo defense of a Yamato-class battleship performed as designed, in that 4 torpedoes did not break into her vital spaces, and an hour after the attack she was making 18 knots with a 10-degree list and 4 boilers online. What destroyed her were the cheapest things aboard, and the ones that take longest to arrange. Doors that fitters install in a week, compartment air testing that takes a few days, ceiling cable penetrations, a couple of shifts of work, teaching a sailor to start a gasoline pump, an hour and a half per man, teaching an engineer how to run a boiler on salt water, 1 session at a training establishment, an abandoned ship drill, 1 morning at anchor. Add all of that together, and you get roughly the period that was struck out by the order of the 1st of July, 1944. So the ship would be ready for a decisive battle that never took place. The Imperial Navy held that tonnage and armor were what survivability consisted of. The United States Navy, by 1944, held otherwise, and you can see it in where the money went. 2 city firemen, 260 instructors, schools at every base, compulsory for everyone, including the galley staff. The distance between those 2 positions became visible on the morning of the 29th of November, when the largest carrier in the world capsized because her evaporator had stopped. Captain Toshio Abe knew all of it in advance. He put it on paper the day before sailing and listed it by item. Doors, compartments, cable penetrations, pumps, no drills. He was refused. He took his ship out into darkness to protect her from aircraft. And he was wrong about nothing in his own reasoning except the number of submarines. There were not 7 of them. There was 1, and she was handled by a man who, a year earlier, had been relieved of command for moving too carefully. Abe stayed on the bridge. The inquiry under the letter S found no one at fault. Joseph Francis Enright served until 1963 and retired as a captain. Afterward, he worked for the Northrop Corporation, designing navigation equipment, which is to say, the instruments that tell a man in the dark where he is and where he is going. He died on the 20th of July, 2000, at Fairfax in Virginia, at the age of 89, and he is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The man who asked to be relieved because he could not find a target in the dark spent the rest of his working life building the things that keep people from getting lost. Of the 1,080 survivors of Shinano, most lived lives about which nothing is recorded because they were forbidden to speak of that ship in December of 1944, and the permission was slow in coming. The engineer Hosokawa, one of the few who gave public testimony, remembered one sound for the rest of his life. Several thousand rivets letting go at once in the bulkhead between the shaft alley and the engine room. The largest warship ever sunk by a submarine stayed afloat for 7 hours and 48 minutes after she was hit. She had taken 4 years, 6 months, and 15 days to build. If this was worth your time, leave a like and subscribe, because that is how stories usually told in 11 minutes end up getting the 40 they deserve. Japan built the biggest ship in the world. She ran out of time to teach her people how to save it.